I'm Brenda Child, who works at the University of Minnesota, and I am also Red Lake Ojibwe from up north. And it's a real pleasure for me to see all of you in this gathering of folks from all over, from Minnesota and beyond, and also just to be a part of and learn more about this conference and the issues that you're going to be addressing. So this is sort of a kind of a framing and goal-setting session today. Lori Watso's comments were also so wonderful this morning. I just came in. I feel a little like my voice is extremely tired because I just came in on that last plane from Washington, D.C. that flew into Minneapolis last night. So I think I got to bed about 1:30. But there was a lot of energy out in D.C. this weekend. I kept running into Indian people all over town this weekend. I was there for a conference, but I also wanted to attend some of the events associated with the opening of the new African American Museum in D.C., which was great, reminding me of how wonderful the opening was of NMAI in 2004. And so it was I ran into Wilson Pipestem when he was out jogging on Saturday morning. So there's all this energy around in D.C. the last few days, and especially thinking today about President Obama's final Tribal Nations summit that you mentioned. And I can only imagine all the timely topics being addressed in Washington today. Of course, the struggle over pipelines and water that Justin mentioned, many environmental issues along with that. The struggle to protect our sacred sites and places and our historic sites. I also sit on the Repatriation Committee at the National Museum of the American Indian, and our chair of the Board of Trustees is Wilson's better half, Brenda Pipestem, a wonderful lawyer, and we wanted to make known to go on record with a recent letter about our objections to kind of what was going on in terms of the desecration of sacred sites out there in the Dakotas. But all of these things happening are just sort of a reminder to me, including this conference here today, how sovereignty needs to be addressed and fought and struggled on all fronts, including the struggle to protect our bodies, the health of our children, and the health of future generations. So I'm just going to very briefly mention the panelists this morning, and then they are going to spend a little bit longer talking about their own important work and tell you a little bit more about themselves. We have with us Garry Ferguson. Garry is the Community Health Services Director for the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. We also have with us Abigail Echohawk from Partnerships for Native Health at Washington State University. From here at Minnesota, we have Tiffany Beckman, medical doctor in the University of Minnesota's Medical School. And then Janie Hipp is continuing on. She is the director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and a professor at law at the University of Arkansas. So this session is really an opportunity for our panelists to kind of talk through the conference goals as they discuss their work and projects. It's also, I think, though, an opportunity for all of us here attending the conference to consider our own goals today and for the next 2 days. And actually, this panel is going to meet up again tomorrow at the end of all these sessions and at the end of all these conversations. And we're going to try to make sense of the big picture with your help. So think about, you'll have a chance during this panel to ask some questions, but I can only imagine you'll have even more comments and questions when we wrap things up tomorrow. So I'm going to ask each of them to kind of begin with about 5 to 7 minutes or so, talking about introducing themselves and talking about their own projects. And we will, my job now will be to be very considerate of time so that we get a 15-minute break too before we go on to our next session after this panel. So we'll start with Garry.
Kila akumna. Good morning. Masang Kangu, Garry Ferguson Akug. I'm Garry Ferguson, and I acknowledge my ancestors who are here with me today, as well as my grandparents, Emil and Marina Gunderson of Senac Island, and Hilton and Clara Ferguson from upstate New York, my grandparents who represent both sides of the country. And as we look at the audience, we represent many nations across the country. And I'm here to really honorably represent our 229 federally recognized tribes in the state of Alaska and our 150,000 Alaska Native people that we serve at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, where our vision is that Alaska Native people are the healthiest people in the world. And I think all of our nations represented would want to say that as our mission and vision, is that we want to see our people be the healthiest people in the world. And I want to give a special acknowledgement to the Shakopee, Metawankaton, Sioux community. Lori, thank you very much, and all of the people who represent the front-runner resource that allows us to gather today, because it's when we gather and we share innovative work that we inspire each other, and we keep the flame inside of us burning. And when we think of the work we're doing in our communities as innovative, it's one that we're closely aligned, and as Janie shared as we were starting, that it has to be locally based. It has to be from our community, and we have to own this. It's not about taking a program from somewhere else and supplanting it from our own. It's about igniting the fire and reclaiming, decolonizing the approaches that we've had all along. And it's about rediscovering that. It's as some of our friends in Alaska like to say, we're re-indigenizing our health system. We're decolonizing our health system, and we're allowing the wisdom that was always there to come forward, the wisdom that our ancestors shared with us. And as Athbascan elder Howard Luke shared with us about food and food system, that if we don't respect the food and if we're not involved in our food system, that food system will go away. And I think it's a really important concept when we think of reclaiming our food system. It's about understanding that we're a vital part of that food system, and through our stewardship of that food system and our respect of that food system, that food system will become vibrant again, and the animals will return. And in Alaska, we see, as we reclaim our food system, we're seeing animals show up and return to regions again. We're seeing the rediscovery of a lot of our plants. And I want to give a shout out to our Alaska people. We have 15 people coming from Alaska here registered. So how about my Alaska peeps? Raise your hand. And our folks all the way from Barrow, even right here in the, so when we think of the journey that many of us have come through, and the time change, 3 hours, getting up this morning at 6:30 was 3:30 our time. So I'm still kind of waking up with you. But it's one where, innovative is one where we think of bringing our practice-based evidence or our local solutions. And I've been in diabetes prevention for many years, and for many years we often were told it has to be an evidence-based approach. And so how do we take our practice-based evidence, the local community solutions that have been working, and how do we bring that to the next level? And that's the important part of working with our universities and our researchers and making sure that we write about it, because if it's not written in the literature, it's not happening. And so we need to connect this innovative work and share that work. And so it's a really important partnership when we look at our university colleagues and folks that are going to help us bring it to the next level. And so as my opening statements, we are here to celebrate success. We're here to celebrate the bright spots of what's working and to inspire each other. Kagasakung. Thank you.
Buju, ha matokwiapio asen. Minogiji God. Greetings, all my relatives. It's a beautiful day today. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say today, and then I realized that I wrote some inspiring things one day when I was in the bathroom at home in my spa, right, with my flute music playing and stuff. So I've got a couple things I want to read to you about what food sovereignty means to me and about our youth. But first, as a Native physician, I just want to say that this work is near and dear to my heart and long overdue. I've waited a long time for this. Years ago I asked Chris Leith, how do you say food is medicine in Dakota? And he said, Aleut pajuta. And anyway, I learned a lot from him and other elders, and I hope to learn a lot more as time goes on about how I can help our people. And I'd like to take a minute and remember the Ochedi Shakowin and our Anishinaabe people and our elders and our ancestors, and know that we're not doing this work alone. In fact, we're doing it with many, many, many people. And so that's what gives me peace, to know that. Anyway, as a Native physician, I can tell you, the topic listed on here is translating research into policy and practice. But for me as a physician, it's really about seeing patients and hearing their stories and realizing, gee, what questions do I have to help them? What don't I know? Or what tools don't I have? What medicines am I missing that they need? And so really it's the people, the individual people that I'm trying to help that leads me to pursue the research, which then, when I see that works, we call it applied clinical research at the university. There are other names for it, but it's helping people. Then I see, gee, that can translate into policy, and so it should, so that many people can be helped. And that's really a public health perspective. So I should just read to you a couple of inspiring things that I wrote. Honestly, I didn't know what I was going to say today, but this stuff came from here one day. And Herb Sam, he's my adopted father, he said to me, Benisi Kwe, you've got to speak from here, not from here, because I used to tangle up my words. So Native food sovereignty is really code talk for protection of our water and our land. For without these things, all of creation will die. We're talking about humanity that hinges on healthy plants and animals, clean water, and a healthy planet. Sovereignty is about honoring our treaties because it is the right thing to do for future generations. Few understand the implications. Many are selfish. Treaties teach us to be selfless, as do our birch bark scrolls. Let us create a home for our children by protecting the water and the earth, so all will have good food to eat in the future. Some people say oil pipelines create jobs and jobs create money. You can't eat and drink money. Remember that. Food sovereignty is at the core of health disparities. So I'm going to say something about youth leadership. I promised Chairman Stanley Crooks before he passed away that I would mentor as many of our students as I could. They are our future. Our work will live on through them. Our community will be healthy because of the investment in our youth made today. First, we must pass down our Indigenous knowledge and our ways of being, living, and staying alive so that they are not lost forever. We must place these youth into places where they can succeed and flourish, in the grand medicine garden of all living beings, and let them listen to the stories of our elders together as they plant the food for future generations. Chimigwich, Wopilatonka, Wopilatonka.
Good morning. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Abigail Echohawk. On my father's side, I am the granddaughter of Whitty and Christabel Echohawk of Pawnee, Oklahoma. On my mother's side, I am the granddaughter of Katie John of Mentasta Lake, Alaska. And Alaska, like Garry, is where I'm from. I was born and raised in the heart of Alaska where I was loved and cherished. And part of that came from my people's connection to the food and to the land of where we're from. And so I'm blessed to be here today and talk about some of the work that I've done as the Director of Partnerships for Native Health at Washington State University. But I don't see the university as who I am. My connection is from my family, from my land, and from my people. So today, instead of telling you some of the work that we've done, I'd like to tell you a story, and a story of my people and of my relatives. I'm going to tell you the story of my Uncle Fred John. So my Uncle Fred is a boarding school survivor. He is a Vietnam veteran, and he is he raised me as one of his own. I grew up next to his children in his house as much as I was in mine. And my Uncle Fred in Matasta Lake Village, when he was about 5 years old, we were still 13 miles away from the nearest highway. So the missionaries would come, and these trucks would come, and they'd drop off these big missionary barrels. And they were barrels full of stuff from the lower 48 states that different churches and organizations had put together, and they would drop it at the top of that, on that dirt road that came by our village. My Grandma Katie and the relatives, they'd come up in their dog sleds, and they would pick up these packages that had been left on the top of the road for them. So one of these packages came through, and they went through, and there's all kinds of random stuff you'd never use in Alaska, and a few useful things. We started getting cuspix made out of all kinds of weird materials like Gary's wearing today. But at the bottom of this one barrel, there was these things. They didn't know what they were. There was a bunch of packages. They looked like little onion sacks. And so they handed them out to the children, because in those little onion sacks were these beautiful, round, shiny objects. And my Uncle Freddie loved it. He's like, he had it for several days. He tossed it around hand to hand. It made this beautiful noise. He just, tucked it in his pocket, brought it places with him. One day, my Grandma Katie sent him down to get firewood at our fish creek. And for us, our fish creek is an important part of who we are. Our salmon in the summer, it turns red with the salmon returning to where they are to replenish the land and to replenish the fish in the creek. So as a kid, we all spent time there. Well, he walked out on the bridge, and he's supposed to be working, but he's not. So he's looking at his little, this thing that he'd been given, and he's standing on the bridge over Fish Creek. There's snow on the ground. There's no sound. And in Alaska, when I say no sound, there's no sound except for the crunching of that snow. And he's standing at that creek, and it's still flowing because it's glacier fed, and it seems like no matter how cold it gets, that creek is still flowing. And he looked at what he had, and he opened up that little bag, made a little hole, and he took out one of those pretty round things, and he dropped it in the water. And he said when he dropped it in the water, it made the most beautiful sound. He was like, ping, and just the tiniest of a ripple. He's like, well, that was really cool. So he dropped all 26 of those beautiful round objects into the bottom of that creek. And then at the end of it, he said he looked at his little onion sack, he put it in his pocket, and he walked away. So it's the best story of when my uncle lost his marbles. He liked to tell it. But as we begin to do this work, that story, these marbles, many kids and, Caucasian children, other people in the lower 48, that was a game that changed lives. You played it all the time. There was things you could do with it. It provided entertainment. But instead of the knowledge of just something being dropped at the top of the road, there was no understanding of what those were or what it could be for a kid at 50 below zero stuck in a house. So instead, it's at the bottom of a creek with the tiniest of a ripple and a single sound. And for many of us who work in Indian country, we know that's the health interventions that have been dropped in on us. So what is our opportunity in partnership? If we had partnered with those people who dropped that barrel on the top of on the road, instead of, what would have happened? What could have been the use and utility of what we could learn together? Because that game's fun. I played it as a kid. It's a lot of fun. There are things that we could have learned from one another. So that's, I think, the opportunity we have right now to develop partnerships, academic partnerships, community partnerships. But that knowledge and where he dropped those marbles was in our creek, where our fish is, when I put my feet in there, when I go to Matasta, I always walk to that river, I freeze my feet off immediately. But I feel connected to that land and to that people. And that's where these interventions are. And we have to be in partnership. We have to grow together, because if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to improve the health and well-being of our tribal communities, we have to build together. So when you think of partnerships, think of marbles, my Uncle Freddie, and what a partnership could have done. Thank you.
So I'm not inclined to say what I just said. I think you've already heard that. And the speakers up here are incredible, and they have so much knowledge. I'm approaching 61. I just received an Elder Award, which kind of gave me cause to pause. because I still, in my head, think I'm 20. Look, I said it previously. The momentum around these issues, I've never seen it before. I've never seen it like this before. I know. It's absolutely incredible. I'm one of the people that strongly believe, too, that while food sovereignty has to be grounded in our communities, we also need our tribal governments, who are also within our communities, to step up and do their part. And many folks love to throw our tribal leadership, whoever they may be, under every conceivable nearby bus. But I will tell you, they do have a role here. Our initiative at the law school was honored to receive support from not only the Shakopee Midwakanton Sioux community, but also Mazon Jewish Response to Hunger. I'm not sure they're here. Agua Fund, Inc., now Kellogg Foundation. And interestingly enough, the Farm Credit Council, to begin a body of work last year to build a model food and agriculture comprehensive code. All right, so everyone up here is going, ugh, lawyers. They just can't get over themselves. Here's what I'm going to tell you. And I tell people this all the time. We've had probably 30 roundtables in various parts of Native country over the last year. We're going to continue that journey. We have undertaken a behemoth project. We have partners who have come to us along the way. But I tell tribal leadership, I tell their lawyers, I tell community people who come to our roundtables that if the code development is missing, then we're going to be missing a significant piece of the puzzle, which is the ability of policies that are at the local level, within our sovereign communities, within our sovereign tribal nations. We actually do need that piece of the web. We need that piece of the fence. We don't need to wall ourselves off like everyone is thinking everyone else should do. We have to, though, think of these policies as a way to keep that momentum going, right? But simultaneously offer those who are trying to protect us from outside forces another tool that they can use to actually help us protect our lands and protect our waters and protect our people. And I tell folks all the time, if we go about this business without thinking of the children and building on the knowledge of our elders, but if we leave the food people behind, if we make their lives miserable, not everyone in this room is a food person. And by food people, I mean the people who grow our food. They exist in a food system within our communities and in the country writ large that is significantly broken. And if we want to fix these issues, we have to seize the momentum, because that's what I'm supposed to be talking about right now. We have to seize the momentum of now, and we have to jointly, together, push forward. We may never see this moment again. We have to go with that level of commitment and excitement and energy and positiveness. This cannot devolve into pointing fingers, letting egos run out of control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't do that. And I will tell you, part of my reason for being so optimistic is seeing what's happening at Standing Rock. That's amazing. And I want all of the tribes who are there and all the tribal leaders who have signed on to support that to then come and let's deal with food too. Water is food. We have to have, they're so intertwined that they can't be separated. And I told someone the other day, if we don't seize this momentum, then shame on us. Shame on all of us. It is us. It is here. It is now. It is this huge tide. I hope everyone up here agrees with me I mean, it's just amazing to watch, but shame on us if we don't move forward. So as we go about today and tomorrow, I hope all of you kind of seize that opportunity. We do need partners who are not within our communities. I'll tell you that right now. I relied on many partners to try to get my work done when I was in D.C., and I'm sure many of you did as well. And the last thing I want to say, because I'm out of time, is our friends in Alaska are, to me, the canary in the coal mine. They are suffering greatly, but they're also seeing things return. While they are in the midst of being challenged at the largest level, I would tell you, they also are going to see the change first, in my opinion. But there's so much going on within our communities, it's even hard to talk about it because you can't do it justice. It is so exciting, and again, never been so optimistic.
Very good. Thank you, panelists. So my first question is really for Tiffany. And what I really want to know is how we create that spa in our own bathroom. That's kind of a refuge for tribal wisdom. But maybe we can talk about that later, over dinner or something. Listening to all these panelists and their optimism and their excitement and enthusiasm and their really doing all this important work in Indian country, I was kind of jotting down notes to myself, and one of my thoughts was, one of the things I wrote down, which we all know, is that our ancestors knew how to live healthy lives. And even in my work as a historian, my recent book was about, there's a large section that was about Ojibwe people and changes in the wild rice harvest here in the Great Lakes. And we know that wild rice is of course associated with Dakota people and history and culture, and associated with Ojibwe people. And it's been a declining resource with the colonization that's taken place in this part of the world. And we're all very concerned about its protection. But one of the things that I really didn't know very much about until I started doing some of my research, in fact, I use this sort of as a kind of a personal metaphor for myself. I always talk about my grandfather's ricing sticks. When I was a girl of about, maybe 13, 14, when you're not that interested in what your grandparents are doing, my mother brought out, my grandfather had passed away the year before I was born, and she brought out, I don't know where they were before this, but his cedar rice knocking sticks. And she talked about what wild rice camp was like when she was a girl. So for years and years, I thought, wow, my grandfather, I knew he spoke just Ojibwe, and he'd been born actually around the Mille Lacs area in the 19th century. He was part of that group that had been moved out of that area. And so he married my grandmother and came up to Red Lake. And so we're all Red Lakers because of my grandmother. But for years, I thought that those ricing sticks represented tradition. It was the kind of the oldest tradition I could imagine from my own family. And then I started doing historical research because it seemed to me that there was a big shift in what happened with Ojibwe people around their labor practices during the reservation era. And what I came to kind of find out through looking at historical records and documents is that for Dakota women, for Menominee women, and for Ojibwe women, the wild rice harvest historically was entirely women's work. That there would be 600 perhaps women in late summer, early fall out harvesting wild rice. And I started to wonder, well, when did that change happen? And one of the things that women did in the summer was go out onto our lakes, into the river headwaters, and they would bind the rice together with sheaves of basswood fiber. And that was sort of a good environmental practice if there was a big storm. But I came to appreciate, as I did more work on this, that it wasn't just about what if a big storm came up, or protecting it from birds. I came to eventually see it as a legal system that empowered women, and that for Ojibwe and other Native women of the Great Lakes, that water was a gendered space. And I never really understood that. I started to look at the historical photographs, and I realized that there was a big shift that happened in the 1930s when I started to see all-male harvests and men out pulling boats and knocking rice. And I started to think, what happened in the 1930s that so much changed in the labor practices of American Indian people here in the Great Lakes? And I started to understand that these changes probably came about in the government work camps of the Great Depression, when men were sort of hired as laborers, and they wanted to harvest wild rice, but they were being paid for this work. And so they went out and began harvesting wild rice. Women still were around, but something shifted in the 1930s that was seemingly kind of a permanent change. So the reservation system, of the early 20th century seemed to change so much, even how labor was organized. And so we sometimes think about, they brought in the flour and the commodities, but it was a whole way of life, including our legal systems and the way we harvested wild rice and all these things that changed so much. So these cedar knocking sticks that I once thought represented tradition, I now began to appreciate that those cedar knocking sticks were part of Indian adaptability to change. My grandfather may have been among the first Ojibwe generation of men to harvest wild rice. And so we are always adapting, but we're kind of keeping still the things that we value most in our traditions. We can make cultural change. So this sort of made me kind of, I think historically, but it made me kind of want to ask our panel a couple of questions and related to some of these changes in our culture. And many of you had brought up the issue of young people and youth and how we're so inspired by our ancestors, but we're also so inspired by the future and what we need to keep for future generations. So I wonder if you want to, anyone or all of you want to say a little bit more about the role of young people in your work and in these issues that you think are really critical for us in thinking about Native American health and nutrition.
Wow.
So I'll start out as far as thinking about next generations, and of course when we think of maternal child health, that's a really important aspect of setting up our next generation for success. And in Alaska, we're learning a lot more about our people, and we know that some of our people have what's called Arctic variants of health, so genetic variants that we often discover them in a more disease-based system where we think of our CPT1A Arctic variant and our congenital sucrase isomaltase deficiency variant, where we don't tolerate sugars or carbohydrates or Western foods. And so we're starting to find out more that we're hardwired for a traditional diet, that diet actually is truly medicine for us, that when we eat Western processed foods that it makes us sick. And we've got young people that are showing up now and are critically sick because of a processed food diet. And so when we think of WIC boxes and other kinds of commodity foods that go to our young families, and we're expected to eat those foods, and I really appreciated that comment that Janie made about having culturally connected food, period, local food. And if it can't be made locally, that we would have it brought in a way that is connected. At least it's traditional-like food. But when we think of our next generation, setting them up for success, it's a really important comment, and it starts early. And in a lot of our traditions, we would prepare for pregnancy, right? And so preconception counseling is a best practice within the Indian Health Service. So really understanding the role that both parents place on the next generation and setting them up for success from a nutrition standpoint. The foods that you eat and prepare for set up that next generation for success, and whether or not that they'll face prediabetes and some of the challenges that many of us face, that a lot of those decisions are made in the health that you give your next generation before you ever become pregnant and conceive. And then also the food that you eat during pregnancy, a lot of studies are showing that those foods in that maternal womb environment affect your food taste preferences. So the foods that you eat impact your next generation, as do the first foods that you introduce. Breast milk being the first food, right? And so all of that sets up our next generation for success. And I think that maternal child health truly is the focus. It needs to be the focus as we look at upstream population health. We need to affect that next generation in the maternal child health realm. Thank you.
There's a danger in asking me about youth. I'm just telling you.
I'll get my timekeeper down here.
And I'm going to make it quick. I tell my husband all the time that on the days that I just want to throw my hands up in the air, those are the days I shift to our youth and I get another burst of energy. When we launched our initiative, we also launched within the first 6 months a Native Youth in Food and Agriculture Summer Leadership Summit. As you can tell at Arkansas, we like to go long with our names. But this is such an amazing event. We went in a few short years from 47 students from 22 tribes to 100 students from 51 tribes. We're going to be growing in 25 to 30 incrementally, as long as we can keep it up. And they have taught me so much. They come from literally all over Native country. We had the Alaska kids are youth. Well, kids. Junior high, high school, and early college age. They're the ones who get off the airplane and are hit in the face with heat and humidity in late July in Arkansas. And I always kind of look at them and go, are you going to stay or are we going to have to put you back on the plane because it's hot? And those young people are just, once they get acclimated after about 48 hours to a new place and a new conversation and new people, they're so bound together. It's amazing. They think intertribally, they work in their groups intertribally. And I have to tell you one story very briefly. A couple of years ago, the very first night we have them all together, we break them up into small groups, and each one of them has a traditional food. And it's their job as a group to figure out how they're going to support that traditional food, keep it moving forward, feed their people healthier, but also just survive locally themselves with a centerpiece around food as their driving force, because they volunteer to come. They are driven by something related to food or they wouldn't be there, right? And the very first, we had several student leaders that came running out of the room and they said, we don't know what to do. And so I went in and I sat down and I listened to the young people who were in that room. Every single one of those young people had been affected by suicide within their families, a close friend, drugs, just some calamity of some major proportion. These are 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds. And I asked them, well, what are you, and they were all just letting it all out into that group. But their task was to come up with what they were going to do around that traditional food. And they decided that they were going to build a group home for young people who needed help. And they were going to surround it with a working farm, and they were going to sell that food into other, places here. And they were going to keep themselves going and keep healing each other through food. And I just was so inspired by that. I have many other stories around that, but I'll tell you that I have total confidence in our young people, total confidence. But I will tell you, they need our help. They need our help right now. But they are the driving force to me. They get this in a way I don't, right? Many of us in the audience. They're going to use the tools deeply rooted in traditions in their own cultures, but they're also going to be able to figure this out in a way that's going to help them bring their community to greater health. I'm very confident in them, and they are probably the most important part of this equation.
Just going to pose one more question before we, and then be thinking of your question too, because we'll open it up here for a couple questions from the audience. But, one of the things that I realize, in teaching American Indian history as I have throughout my adult life, you realize that really teaching Indian history is also about trying to understand more about the history of disease and Native communities, because it has always really been a present issue since colonization. There were, the first wave was the epidemics that Native people experienced, right? So we know now that in some areas of North America, the depopulation was as great as 90%. It's kind of hard to fathom. And then with the reservation era, kind of with the decline of our traditional ways of making a living and feeding ourselves and working in our traditional ways, this is when the tuberculosis problem began, which I also had to understand more about when I was doing some of my early work on boarding school history. Another problem associated really with the boarding schools themselves was the eye disease of trachoma, for which there really was no treatment until sulfa drugs were introduced in the late 1930s. So people suffered from this. And in the early 20th century, public health officials in the United States around 1913 acknowledged that the trachoma epidemic on reservations was being created by children coming back from boarding school and spreading the disease. And this was pretty much strictly an Indian health problem in the first half of the 20th century. And then drugs came along and that sort of went away. But it makes me wonder, since there have been health issues and resolutions to some of those health crises that we've experienced, how optimistic are you about our future when it comes to diabetes?
I'm very optimistic. One of the areas that I've been working in quite a bit is epigenetics. So epigenetics is looking at the actual, what are we made of, our very genes. And we know through epigenetic studies that we can tell that there has been some changes, particularly around obesity and diabetes, in the genetics of American Indians and Alaska Natives. And that's kind of scary. We don't want to have put out there that, maybe we're not as good as everybody else, or there's all kinds of, how do we communicate in this in the best way? But what I see in that, when I hear there's been a change, is from all of the trauma our people have experienced, we have always had resilience, and we carry that within our DNA also. And if it changed as a result of the generational trauma and historical trauma that we have experienced, we can change it back. We are at the cusp of changing it back. This meeting right now is us coming together to say we are not accepting this as normal, and that we can and will change this back. And that nutrition is not just the food that's sitting on your tables, it's the land you put your feet on. It's the water you bring into your body. It's the stories you tell your children. And I was thinking about your question about the youth, and I have a 15 and a 13-year-old sons, and I travel a lot for work, and I was telling my son, I come back and I tell him how much I love him, and he was looking at me, and he'd recently been spending time with my father, who was there while I was gone, and I was like, I love you this much, I love you to the moon and back. He looked at me, he said, Mom, I have loved you since I was a star in the sky, and I chose you. I was like, oh, we're star people. It's like, you chose me. And what is my responsibility to him? for these next generations that have chosen us to make this change. So we have the ability, and I can look at it through the science that I do in epigenetics, and you can see it in the way that you work in your environmental work. But I have so much optimism because we are on the cusp of great change, and it is going to be led by Native people for Native people.
That's absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful and absolutely true. I think, you mentioned something about epigenetics, and, I've spent a long time around people that are talking about genetics and talking about it in a way that isn't very empowering for people. And so what I like to do is try to be able to bring the message out to say, epigenetics is something that can be changed or modulated, okay? So that's the point there, that it's not a death sentence, something you have and you get. This is something that can be changed. And I think that's powerful. And that's the message that I want everybody to understand, that we can change the expression of genes through nutrition and physical activity. And it's critical that that information get out into our communities so that we're empowered and understand that, if there is a higher predilection for diabetes, and there is in some of our populations, that it can be reversed. And certainly if people do get a diagnosis, it's manageable, very manageable. And people don't have to suffer, by losing their vision or going on dialysis or losing their legs and so forth. That does not have to happen. In fact, we are going to talk more in this conference later about curing diabetes, because nutrition is really about curing diabetes. It's about preventing it, treating it, managing it, and curing it. And I'm going to say those words because I think we need to use that kind of language to empower people to really understand that we're at the cusp of something great here. And I thought that it wouldn't happen in my generation. I really didn't think it would happen. I thought about this, and I thought, a day is going to come when the Wasicha or the Chimook's going to come up and approach us again and say, how is it that we survive in this new world? Because we're looking at areas of the earth that have been desecrated, and then all of these storms come and these environmental changes that people try to explain. It's like, don't try to explain it, pray about it. Okay, pray about it. Ask for forgiveness for violating Mother Earth and the land, and come together as a people and work together, because we, as a people, can take care of this through nutrition and physical activity and respecting the earth and the water and respecting everyone. And when we interact with one another, bringing our best self to the table, okay? That self that loves everybody, respects everybody, and wants to bring that good energy. Because what people don't talk about in Western medicine is the kind of energy that's in the room or in the people that passes from one to another, that we share collectively. And as living beings, we all share that. The plants share that. Everybody shares that. And we forget that, and I think that's so important. It's not something we go around measuring, and God help me, I hope they don't start wanting to try to figure that out. But anyway, I think I've talked too long, but I wanted to say that diabetes is something that we don't have to have here in the New World. And that day has come when we've been asked, as Indian people, by everyone, how is it that we survive here in the New World? Well, we survive by respecting and protecting our children, our plants, the earth, and the water, so that we can have food for future generations.